Okay, so let's start with the aspects of meditation. And the idea of these various aspects is that I add a new aspect or dimension, something to think about. The idea here is to just change our view, our worldview of what meditation could be or could be related to. It adds another facet. The first one I mentioned, just to review, is that practice, it's called meditation practice for a good reason. And scientific research recently uh, discovered that the brain is restructured when you meditate. And there's some really great current research utilizing MRI, particularly functional MRI, and they can watch the neural connections in the brain develop differently in people who meditate versus those that don't. So by practicing, what you're doing anytime you practice is that you're restructuring the brain and adding new neural pathways, sometimes to an existing set of pathways, but you're always building these organic pathways in the brain. And if you think of any time that you learn something, and I think we use the example of learning to play the piano, that at first playing the scale of C was really difficult. You didn't know where to put your thumb. You didn't know where to put your index finger when you were going backwards on the scale. It was very clumsy. But as you practiced, it got more and more accurate, and you were able to play that scale faster and faster with perfect tempo. That's because you built more neural pathways that controlled your ability to do that. The same is true with meditation. So regular practice allows you to reach these levels, these other aspects, more regularly and consistently, and whenever you want to. So practicing gives you the skill to achieve these benefits of meditation whenever you need them. The second idea that we talked about was our view of the conscious mind versus the subconscious. And I kind of don't like those terms because it's kind of misleading. It implies that our conscious mind is more valuable than our subconscious. And actually, I think it's the reverse. And I like to talk about what we call conscious. Being conscious is just being aware. So you fall asleep at night and you're no longer aware, but you still have a conscious awareness. Your body still works. If you're tickled, you move. And even probably you experience talking to someone when they're asleep, and they'll answer you. But ask them in the morning what the conversation was, and they don't remember because they weren't aware. And as you wake up in the morning, you become aware of the world around you, and you start to connect with who you are and what you got to do, and if you have to go to school or work. So I like to use the term conscious awareness and consciousness of the being. And a lot of literature out there talks about the superconscious or the supraconscious or the expanded mind. Well, I think it's just this innate ability that is all of you. So the subconscious is a good thing, and it's there to learn any techniques, any skills that you need on a regular basis, and then you don't have to think about them consciously. So again, using an example of piano, or maybe the example of driving the car, you learn how to drive a car and you get so good at it that you don't have to think about it. And I've even found myself daydreaming driving on long drives and then wake up, and I've still stayed on the road and everything was fine because my, quote, subconscious was able to do that for me without me paying much attention to it. So the subconscious is very important. So our meditation practice allows us to become more in tune with this greater consciousness, with this, call it the greater self. Not to make a big deal of it, but it's really who you are that you're not aware of on a moment-to-moment basis. The next thing we talked about, the third thing, the third dimension of meditation, is brainwave frequencies. And this was really picked up in parallel with sleep research. When they put EEGs on people and they measured what happened to the brain wave frequencies when people fell asleep, and went through the various stages of sleep, they found there were bands of frequencies that were related to physiological changes. And these bands, these frequencies, are measured in hertz, beats per second, and the slowest is less than a second, half a second every beat, right up to the extremes of 100 beats per second. And this range of frequencies, broken up into bands, starts at, if you go from the high end, over 30 beats per second, is normally referred to as beta or gamma, sort of high awareness, very alert, ready to act. And some people relate the higher frequencies to the fight or flight response. You're ready to go. Your brain's moving very quickly. But then as you begin to move down in the frequency ranges into what they call alpha, slower frequencies, it's associated with maybe with you having your eyes closed, listening to music, or pre-sleep where you get a little bit drowsy. And then as you go lower and lower into the frequencies, you go into theta, which is associated with being asleep, so that you're starting to go. You've maybe lost your sense of self, and you go off into a dream world. Theta is associated with dreaming. It doesn't have to be, but REM sleep sometimes connected with that level, theta. And then when you drop even slower, you want to delta. The important thing is here, there are different physiological responses that take place at these frequencies. And it's automagic. It happens immediately. So when the body senses the brain going into the higher frequencies, it gets ready to act. When the body senses the brain going into like alpha, the slower frequencies, it relaxes. The blood pressure goes down, heart rate goes down, and it gets ready to sleep. People start to yawn, and etc., etc. Very important. Well, how this relates to meditation is they found out that the sequence of going into lower, slower frequencies happens when you meditate. So meditators are able to access these lower frequencies, slower frequencies, and stay aware. So they can stay consciously aware and go into these lower states. Why is that beneficial? Well, this means that during your waking day, as you're working, doing things, dealing with the outside world, you can generate these lower, very healthy, very important frequencies anytime you want. And so you might find that meditators generally emit or have about them some calm vibration. Well, it's an actual frequency that you can measure. And some people are very sensitive to other people when they're in these frequencies. So meditating on a regular basis gives you access to these lower healthy frequencies. The fourth thing we talked about last week was the left and right brain. And some of you, hopefully everyone knows that the brain is divided into a left and right hemisphere. And these hemispheres are relatively independent, and they communicate through a very small fiber link between the two hemispheres, and it keeps them in sync. Now, how this is important is that the frequencies that we talked about earlier are generated independently by both brains. So your left brain can be generating higher beta type frequencies, and your right brain can be generating lower, slower frequencies. You can imagine that's kind of an imbalance kind of situation. And they talk about whole brain functioning, and there are institutes that measure the frequencies of the brain and compare the left and right hemispheres with the objective of identifying an imbalance and the techniques to help you balance. Meditation that we're doing helps to stimulate balance between the left and right brains. You probably have heard the expression, someone's a left brain, someone's a right brain, and sometimes it's associated left brain being more analytical, right brain being more creative, and there's been a lot of different things. The important thing is that the whole brain works in a very, very interesting way. So people who have had an injury where the connection between the two brains has been severed, and I believe there is a procedure where doctors do that deliberately to control seizures. But anyway, when they test people who have no connection between the left and right brain, they will do things like, if they only see a word with one eye, they might know what that word means, but they won't be able to say it. Or if they show them a picture of a shovel, if they view it with, say, the right side of the brain, they'll know the word, but they won't know what it's for. And vice versa. They'll see the picture of a shovel, they know it's for digging, but they won't be able to come up with the word. So it's very important that the left and brain communicate evenly. And meditation does that, and we'll talk more about that. And the fifth thing that I mentioned just briefly was the three possibilities. And a few weeks ago I mentioned that prior to Einstein, all of science and the worldview was based on a duality, a Newtonian view of the world where there was a right and wrong. And I know Einstein disliked the emerging philosophies of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. And he's noted as saying that God does not play gamble with the universe. He doesn't throw dice to come up with things. Whereas Heisenberg and Borg and Max Planck, the founders of quantum physics, argued with Einstein. He said, no, God is like the casino. God knows the odds. So it's not really gambling. You know the probability of something happening. Doesn't mean it will. So they came up with a third state. So something can be yes, something can be no, but then something can be in an unknown state. And this is the underpinning, these three states is the underpinning of quantum mechanics. And I think I mentioned before, the new computers that they're making, quantum computers, are tri-state. They have three states. And these states are only measured at the end of at the end result of the computer program, or whatever they're trying to figure out. While it's calculating, they can't look at it. And this is called the observation effect, that in nature there's a whole vast array of probabilities, unknown states, but when you measure it, you collapse all these possible states down to one. And this is called collapsing the infinite array of possibilities. So these three states are very important. And as it turns out, this unknown state is perhaps the most important. Okay, we can talk more about these later. And I'm going to move on now to talk about our guiding principles. And I first encountered these from a gentleman called Bill Harris some years ago, and he has an institute in the States, and he put together these 9 principles. He didn't create them, I didn't create them. They go back to many, many years. And the first one, and I'll try to give you a sense of that, the first one is being okay about whatever it is. Not resisting reality, not resisting things as they are. And you can go to hundreds of years BC, when it was Buddha who identified the 3 sources of pain and suffering, of not being okay. And this principle that Buddha came up with really covers the whole idea that you are empowered to be okay about whatever it is. Choosing not to be okay does not change it. So you can be as upset as you want about your reality, about the way things are, but it isn't going to change it. Action changes it. So being able to move on with your life and just accept what it is doesn't mean that you have to like it. Doesn't mean that you have to be wishy-washy about what's happening in your life. It just means that you don't resist it and you move on. Another example of someone who's done a lot of work, or some group, is the Beatles. And you might remember the Beatles. They had a song, Let It Be, became very popular. Another one, All You Need Is Love. And these carry the theme of being okay with whatever it is and moving on with your life. Very powerful concept. The second one is threshold, and you can find a lot of information about the threshold in the psychology and psychiatric literature. But the initial point, your threshold is sort of two aspects. There's a point where you initially become aware of something in your environment that you're not okay about. And then as you get more and more stimulus from whatever it is in your environment that is not making you okay, and you get more exposure to it, your sense of being uncomfortable or being irritated increases until you hit a maximum of your threshold, which then causes you to have a reaction. On a mechanical level, one example I saw was holding your hand over a hot element on a stove. And you might not feel anything right away, but then after a while you begin to get that initial sense of heat on your hand, and at some point you hit the maximum threshold where you have to move your hand away because it's too hot. So these thresholds kind of have two sort of dimensions to it: the initial phase and the maximum reaction phase that triggers you. Now, why is this important? Because if you are not aware that you're hitting the threshold, you may not know when you all of a sudden are not okay about something. And you may come home after work and be quite upset and not realize that you've gone through a threshold and been exposed to some input. I'll use the word input, but it could be something that you're experiencing, but it could be a memory, or it could be some thought of the future. It doesn't have to be something happening right now. So being aware threshold is your big indicator. It's like a big flag. Here's something that you need to be aware of. And maybe it's a way of your subconscious in saying, hey, take a look at this. This is something that if you can learn to deal with, you'll become a stronger person. Which brings up to the fourth principle, which is chaos and reorganization. Chaos and reorganization is when you cross into your threshold area and you hit that maximum point. If you back away from it, and you always have that choice, and most people do, nothing happens. You go back and you forget about whatever the irritant was, and you go about your day. But if you go through that threshold, depending on how significant the learning is that you have to go through, you will go into chaos. So if you ever had to make a big change in your life, quit a job, move, leave someone, or whatever it is, make a major change in your life, there's a period of chaos, a period of uncertainty. And you don't know what the outcome is. You know you have to go through this threshold. You know you have to make the change. So you just bite the bullet and go through the chaos. During the chaotic phase, you don't really know what's going to happen. Anything can happen. But what's interesting is that the majority of time, people reorganize from that chaos and become stronger. Very, very seldomly does someone become weaker or less capable after they've gone through a threshold, experienced the chaos, and reorganized. It just seems to be a law of nature that you reorganize and become more capable of dealing with whatever it was that gave you that threshold experience. And this is basically true with the physical world too, so they can examine this phenomenon in the physical world. And I think one of the examples I used was the chaos of the universe when it was first created. Total chaos, just explosion, gas flying all over the place, no definition, and all of a sudden, boom, there was one element, hydrogen. Chaos kept going on and explosions, and then it reorganized, and we got a second element, helium. And this is how they explain that even though there's chaos and deterioration, the universe reorganizes. You will reorganize. I could go on, but I won't. We're going to go to the fifth component, which is your internal map, your internal sense of self. That's the reason people avoid chaos. Because as I suggested, if you know that the chaos is going to result in a more capable you, a reorganized you, why doesn't everyone charge happily through their threshold into chaos? The main reason is They don't want to change. They think who they are is fixed. They believe that their internal ego, you call it ego, I like to call it your internal map of reality, is really them. But it isn't. It's really a built-up series of experiences from the moment you were born to your current state, where you've trained yourself, you've got a name, you have education, you have beliefs. And this sense of self is what people hang on to, and they're afraid to go through the reorganization and become something different. So if you believe that your map is the territory, that the map you're holding in your hand is actual real, you won't throw away a map and get a new one. The sixth principle is conscious change, and I like to think of people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, all the people that created significant change in our society did it simply by raising consciousness, raising awareness, and it caused change. And we use the guided meditation, walking through the body, as an example of just observing and noting the change. Also mentioned the fact that this is related to the observation effect. It's that in science they now have proven that the mere act of observing changes. The underlying principle here is that your subconscious or your greater self really wants you to go to the best possible state. So just by being aware of your environment, being aware of what's happening, you will tend to move towards what is better. As you understand some mental state or behavior that you're having is actually hurting you, not being aware that it's hurting, you will continue to do it. But the moment you become aware of it, the tendency is to move away from that behavior or mental state. So just being aware, conscious awareness is a technique, very, very powerful technique. And again, I did mention Gandhi, who changed all of India, or Martin Luther King, who changed a whole nation and infected the whole world in terms of how people treated other people who were different. Finally, the last topic is witnessing. And witnessing is very important. Witnessing is being able to observe yourself and your surroundings without going into state 1 or 3, by staying into that undefined state. You're just observing, you're not judging, you're not trying to put a label on anything. And one example of when people may experience witnessing, and it's kind of unusual feeling to observe things without making any kind of judgment. But if you had a traumatic experience or had to do something suddenly, you might go into that state as a way of making it happen. I know when I was quite young, I was home alone, and it's a bang at the door. It must have been pre-high school. And there's a guy at the door totally upset. And it was a truck driver, and he had hit somebody with the mirror of his truck. And the driver was totally freaked, so he went and used the phone, and he was immobilized. He couldn't do anything. All he could do was call the police. And so he took me down to where the person was, and I just automatically took the person's pulse and checked their forehead, checked their eye. I didn't know. I didn't even think about it. It was like I was observing myself do it. I had no hesitation in checking this poor fellow who had been hit, and he unfortunately died. But had I thought about it, I probably wouldn't have gone down the road and checked this guy. But I went into that witnessing state where I knew something had to be done, and I just observed myself doing it. So witnessing is very, very, very powerful, and it's talked about in many schools of meditation. And when you're doing your meditation, the ideal state is to be in that open mind state and just be the observer and watch what's going on inside as you meditate, not judging, not making any kinds of conclusions, but just being the observer, like a researcher measuring something. Well, those are the 7th, and in the next session we'll do number 8, and wrap it up there.